Yes, but I'm sure people will remember Martin spoke to us last year, and that was he's brought out a book quite recently, telling really all sorts of stories about his life and his filmmaking, how he started off, and it's a very interesting book. I've got a copy. Actually, perhaps we could send you the title later in the session in case anybody else would like to get it. It is,
You can hold
um,
a copy as well.
I'm happy to carry on with your introduction as you've done it, Patsy. So, shall I begin by saying good morning and thank you
okay,
for when I
thank you.
spoke about my memoir, Matters of Life and Death, Living with History in a Pandemic. Last Monday, I watched a recording of that talk and heard our 7-month-old hope for a ceasefire in Gaza. After viewing the recording, I saw a Reuters news agency dispatch from Gaza saying that, according to Palestinian medics, Israeli military strikes in the Gaza Strip have killed at least 70 people over the last day, and that, according to the Israeli military authority, all those targeted on the strike were involved in terrorist activities. On that same day in Europe, according to the Ukrainian army, over 1,700 Russian soldiers have been killed or wounded. Matters of life and death, indeed. All coming to the surface after most of us have had a comfortable Christmas season of warmth and good food. Unless you were unlucky enough to be part of a British family with children and living in abject poverty. How many of those can there be? It is important to remember that children are more likely to live in low-income households than the overall population. In March last year, the BBC Verify unit declared that a quarter of all British children live in absolute poverty. In April, the House of Lords Library said the government has estimated that 4.3 million children, or 30% of all children in the UK, were living in relatively low-income households. Child Poverty Action Group estimates that in an average school class of 30 pupils, 9 of the children will be living in poverty. In June last year, academics at King's College London published an investigation into UK austerity policies that they think have caused 190,000 excess deaths. Taking into account the years of life lost, say the authors, we conclude that the cost of austerity significantly exceeded the benefits derived from reduced public expenditure. Last month, the European Journal of Public Health published a paper warning, given that austerity policies seem to be continuing under the new Labour government, it is vital that policymakers of all political parties in the UK fully understand the evidence of worsening birth trends, their likely causes, and their future implication for child and adult health. Next week, academics from Glasgow University are launching a book that in its title asks if British policies of austerity are social murder. Mass death, especially of children, has been a feature of British life for centuries. It's something I refer to in my own book, but only touched on briefly in my last talk. Today, I would like to talk about what I believe is a shameful and persistent lack of concern for the lives and health of our poorest children and their families. Thinking about such things remains a part of the Christmas season, thanks in part to the numerous appearances and words of the miser Ebenezer Scrooge in Charles Dickens' famous story, A Christmas Carol. In the novella, Scrooge is visited on Christmas Eve by three ghosts: Christmas past, present, and future. The ghosts take Scrooge on a frightening journey, revealing how his refusal to help those in poverty will end with Scrooge becoming overwhelmed with guilt and despair. On Christmas Day, Scrooge wakes up a changed man. He's altruistic, kind, and generous. A perfect ending for Hollywood films and television advertisers. Excuse me. Charles Dickens' personal appearance of childhood poverty and labour deeply influenced his depiction of children in very successful novels like David Copperfield and Oliver Twist. But it was the content of a parliamentary commission on children's employment that inspired Dickens to write A Christmas Carol. The commission's findings in 1842 so disturbed Dickens that he planned writing a rousing pamphlet entitled An Appeal to the People of England, before deciding that a Christmas-themed story would come down with 20 times more force. For me, reading the Commission's evidence has more powerful impact than even Alistair Sim's portrayal of Ebenezer Scrooge. Evidence that's so striking, I reprinted sections of it in my book. How tough things could be in the 19th century for working children was revealed a week after Queen Victoria's coronation. On July the 4th, 1838, a 2-hour thunderstorm at a Yorkshire village near Barnsley flooded the local coal mine. 26 children working underground lost their lives. Among them, James Birkenshaw, 7 years old, Catherine Garnett, 8 years old, John Gothard, 8 years old, Sarah Jukes, 8 years old, George Lamb, 8 years old, Sarah Newton, 8 years old, William Walmsley, 8 years old, Annie Moss, 8 years old, Amos Wright, 8 years old. The disaster is said to have shocked the young Queen, and a royal commission was set up to look at the employment of children in Britain's mines. Somewhat unusually, the commission, headed by the future Lord Shaftesbury, employed 20 sub-commissioners to take evidence directly from the colliers and children who worked in the mines. Their findings were placed before Parliament in April 1842. According to the report, in Durham pits, the practice of employing children only 6 and 7 years of age to work in the mine is all but universal, and there are no short hours for them. The children go down with the men, usually at 4 in the morning, and remain in the pit between 11 and 12 hours. More generally, the Commission declared in some areas 1/3 of the persons employed are under 18 years of age, and that more than a third of this proportion are under 13 years of age. From 6 years old and upward, said the report, the hard work of pushing and dragging the carriages from the workings begin. The sub-commissioner for Derbyshire described the scene. The child in the front is harnessed by his belt or chain to the wagon. The 2 boys behind are assisting in bringing it forward. Their heads are brought to a level with the wagon, and the body is in an almost horizontal position. The boy in front goes on his hands and feet. Janet Cummings, 11 years old. I gang with the women at 5 and come up with the women at 5 at night. I carry large bits of coal. The weight is usually a hundredweight. The roof is so low I have to bend on my legs, and the water frequently comes up to the calves of my leg. Mary Drysdale, 15 years old. I don't like the work, but my mother is dead and father brought me down. My employment is to draw the carts. I have a harness like the horses and pull the carts. Sub-Commissioner Thomas Pearce from the West Riding of Yorkshire. They hurry with belt and chains. There are as many girls as boys about here. On descending Mr. Heburn's pit at Barnsley, I found a group of men, boys and girls, some of whom were of the age of puberty. The girls, as well as the boys, stark naked down to the waist. Many Victorians were shocked by the children's labour and by them working in mixed, semi-naked groups. A parliamentary bill to transform working conditions was watered down in the House of Lords, where the Marquess of Londonderry spoke for the Yorkshire coal miners and insisted that the mines were places where boys from 8 to 14 should be employed, as the underground roads could not be made of sufficient height for taller persons without incurring an outlay so great as to render the working of such mines unprofitable. The Earl of Radnor, another opponent of the bill, objected to interference in the labour market and what he called an attempt to enforce morality by Act of Parliament. But by August 1842, Parliament had agreed that no child under 10 and no females could be employed to work underground. 20 years later, a school inspector explained why so many fathers forced their children out to work. The earnings of an adult operative are insufficient to support himself and the children. Compel them to go to school, and you drive the family to the workhouse. In 1861, another Royal Commission claimed if a child's wages are important to the family economy, it is far better that the child should go to work at the earliest age at which it can bear the physical exertion than it should remain at school. Today, our establishment has a very different approach, but British children are still the victims of political and economic ideologies. In 2019, the United Nations Children Rapporteur published a report saying, although the United Kingdom is the world's fifth largest economy, 1/5 of its population, 14 million people, live in poverty, and 1.5 of them experienced destitution. Policies of austerity introduced in 2010 continue largely unabated despite the tragic consequences. Food banks have proliferated, homelessness and rough sleeping have increased greatly. Philip Hammond, Britain's Chancellor of Exchequer at the time, said, I reject the idea that there are vast number of people. I reject the idea that there are vast numbers of people facing dire poverty in this country. I don't accept the UN rapporteur's report at all. I think it's nonsense. Look around. That's not what we see in this country. In the Children's Society Good Children Report of 2020, Chief Executive Mark Russell wrote, since 2009, children's unhappiness with their lives has been in decline. Compared to 23 European countries by age, 15 of our young people are the least satisfied with our life. They rank the lowest in having a sense of purpose in life. They have the second highest levels of sadness. What have we done that created a society in which 15-year-olds feel this way? We should be ashamed. 4 years later, Mark Russell, in his report for 2024, told readers, if you feel like this message is being repeated every year, then you would be correct. We continue to see a decline in the overall well-being of our country's young people. This is of grave concern. Behind these numbers and statistics are real children feeling unhappy about their life. The latest data from the Children Commissioner highlighted that NHS waiting times showed that over 270,000 children were still awaiting mental health support, that the ongoing cost of living crisis and financial hardship experienced by many households across the UK has continued. The latest official statistic by the Department for Work and Pensions revealed that a record 4.3 million children were living in poverty in the financial year ending 2023, an increase of 100,000 since the previous financial year. Those findings were echoed by the National Education Union report in April of 2024, with teachers and support staff regularly paying out their own pocket to help disadvantaged pupils in their care. A report by the Food Foundation, published in June 2024, highlighted the impact that poverty has on children's health, as they warn of a significant deterioration in the health of UK children, who are now shorter in height and likely to suffer with ill health. What I'd like to do here, I have lots more I'd like to say, but I'd like to hear from you about your experiences and your views of the state of children as a child and an adult in the world in which we are today. So please, can we hear from someone else other than me for a few minutes?
Well, I'd like to say something about my experience. I was a head teacher of Gayhurst Infants and Nursery School for several years in the 80s. At the time, we had in our school children from maybe 12 different language communities. One of the main second languages was Hungarian, where families had fled communism. We had wonderful support. When I had a little boy, Ferenczy, who was Hungarian, who clearly was a strange little boy, he used to collect his school dinner and he would take 3 steps forward and 2 steps back. So clearly, he was a child with special education needs. Thanks to the Warnock Commission, there was support. I raised concerns. We had a case conference. We had social workers. We had someone from the embassy with an interpreter to explain to Ferenczy's family that we weren't thinking of taking him away. We wanted to help him. And the help was there. This was at the time when Blair was Prime Minister, when his mantra was education, education, education. And immediately, as a head teacher, I had courses that my non-teaching staff could go to understand what we were about in helping children learn. That was the important thing. One of the set texts that we had was how children think and learn. So we were trying to understand these young human beings. I'm sorry to be so angry, but I think things have changed. When I was a head teacher, I know they were different. I'm not going to say any more, but I think you were talking about the 19th century. You're making generalizations, children this, children that. I can say within my school, our children, we looked on as a family. We were able to give them immense support. And what happened? The Margarine Queen Cowbitch became Prime Minister. enough said. I'll say no more, because that woman was a force of total destruction of state education. Sorry, I won't say any more.
I like your anger.
Martin, it's so sobering to hear this, and distressing and sad, and hard for me to sort of add to it, because I know it's true, and you're saying it so eloquently and clearly with knowledge, but it's very distressing to hear that in this, the phrase is day and age. This is an age of oligarchs and kleptocrats. We are living in a world where fully half of the wealth has been secured by those who are corrupt and at the top running the country. I cannot imagine that things would not be incredibly different if our society had twice as much money flowing through it for the benefit of everybody at every level. So I'm alluding to the awfulness and the cause of it, and you're describing that awfulness, and it's just so sad.
I tell you what, let me go on to start with a slightly happier bit. I'd like to give you a bit more history. I do intend to come to the present day. Do please forgive me if you think I'm rabbiting on a little bit too much. Anyway, I've enjoyed football for a long time myself, and there were some wonderful Saturdays when my dad would visit me during my long childhood stay in hospital. He did more than visit. After I'd been lifted up in a body-length plaster cast and placed in a canvas gurney, he would wheel me out into the street and off to St James's Park to watch Exeter City's football team. Watching matches at Bristol Rovers today, I still recall how good it was watching a game with my dad. He would be staggered to know that in the 20th century, 1 million of our children are going hungry. Our MPs know it's happening, yet under the banner of austerity, it continues. Meanwhile, our wealthiest citizens get richer and richer. It's a tradition Britain has followed since the enclosure of our common lands and the Industrial Revolution. Political economy and laissez-faire ideas have been more important than saving lives. The historian Norman Davies says that it was the terrible clearances which allowed loyalist landowners to expel their inhabitants in favour of sheep, which gave the highlands a haunting emptiness which unknowing tourists have admired ever since. Combined with the enclosure movement, which has been driving smallholders from the land in England for 2 centuries or more, the clearances completed a purging process which was to give British society some of its most abiding characteristics. Henceforth, said Davies, the soil was largely the property of a narrow class of farmers and landowners. British society was divided into a well-endowed loyalist minority and a dispossessed majority, who would only carry half-remembered resentments of their disinheritance into the very bowels of the British class system. Here's a report of a highland clearance in the Isle of Skye by a Scottish geologist, Archibald Geek. One afternoon, as I was returning from a ramble, a strange wailing sound reached my ears on the breeze from the west. It was a miscellaneous gathering of at least 3 generations of crofters. There were old men and women, too feeble to walk, who were placed in carts. The younger members of the community on foot were carrying their bundles of clothing and effects. while the children, with looks of alarm, walked alongside. A cry of grief went up to heaven, the long plaintive wail like a funeral coronach. The people were on their way to be shipped to Canada. John Buchan, the novelist most famous for his adventure story, The 39 Steps, was, like Charles Dickens, keen to influence the lives of British children. Buchan became Governor General of Canada in the 1930s, when the Canadian government was seizing thousands of Indigenous children and imprisoning them in residential schools to ensure that their native customs would die out. Buchan did not change that policy. 3 years ago, the New York Times carried a report from Canada. A new discovery offers chilling evidence that many of the missing children may have died in these schools. Remains of as many as 751 people, mainly Indigenous children, were found at the site of the former school in the province of Saskatchewan. The burial site, the largest one to date, was uncovered only weeks after the remains of 215 children were found in unmarked graves on the ground of another former church-run school for Indigenous students in British Columbia. In 2008, Canada and Australia both formally apologised for taking Indigenous people from their families. I wonder how long it will be, if ever, for British politicians to apologise for the hardship and lives shortened by children and parents because of austerity. I think the most egregious economic policy of our time may have been the years of the Great Irish Famine that began in 1845. In 1848, Sir Charles Trevelyan of the British Treasury was knighted by Queen Victoria for his hard work during the famine, a famine that Trevelyan regarded as the act of an all-wise and all-merciful providence that could bring about a salutary revolution in the habits of a nation. Trevelyan supervised an economic policy that permitted starvation, typhus, dysentery, and more to claim the lives of an estimated 1 million people. Our history has been nurtured with hypocrisy and confidence tricks about British values and actions. We've been lied to about the reasons for continuing poverty, about Northern Ireland, about foreign wars, about torture, about slavery, about genocide. We have been and are still being influenced by great Victorian thinkers like Charles Darwin, who was writing on the origins of species whilst Ireland was starving. Publishers today rarely put Darwin's complete title on the book's cover. It's double-barreled. On the origin of species by means of natural selection, or the preservation of favoured races in the struggle for life. In chapter 2, Darwin writes, "We behold the face of nature bright with gladness. We often see a superabundance of food. We do not see, or we forget, that the birds which are idly singing around us mostly live on insects or seeds and are thus constantly destroying life. Or we forget how largely these songsters and their eggs or their nestlings are destroyed by birds and beasts of prey." Darwin was a sensitive family man who believed that, quote, "the love of all living creatures is the most notable attribute of man." He opposed slavery. He was also a thoroughgoing racist who noted with equanimity and satisfaction that the partial or complete extinction of many races and sub-races of man is historically known, and that from the war of nature, from famine and death, the production of higher animals directly follows. So much for the love of all living creatures. It was Charles Darwin's half-cousin Francis Galton, an explorer and polymath, who invented what has been called the science of eugenics. He did so after measuring human attributes that included longevity and success in life. According to Galton, it is the first step with farmers and gardeners to endeavour to obtain good breeds of animals. A question was then forced upon me. Could not the race of men be similarly improved? Could not the undesirables got rid of and the desirables multiplied? Galton graded human beings and placed the ancient Greeks in pole position, followed soon after by the British. He labelled North American Indians melancholic. The Irish he found to be low and coarse. Coming bottom in his measurements were the Aboriginal people of Australia. Just above them came African Negroes. Galton wanted to improve the British race mentally and physically so that it would be, quote, better fitted to fulfill our vast imperial opportunities. The history of the world, he said, tells a tale of the continuous displacement of populations, each by a worthier successor, and humanity gains thereby. He notes that the number of races of mankind that have been entirely destroyed under the pressures of the requirements of an incoming civilization reads us a terrible lesson. Probably in no former period of the world, he writes, has the destruction of the races of any animal whatever been effected over such wide areas and with such startling rapidity as in the case of savage man. I wonder if anybody has anything to say about empire or how they remember the empire was taught about and read about when they were younger.
Oh, well, it was, I remember Empire Day, for example. I'm not sure how old I was. I think perhaps 6, 7. And we had long trestle tables all the way down the road. And everyone was wearing red, white, and blue and waving flags. And it was a scene, it was believed, great triumph, you know. We were like kings. We were top of all the nations in the world because they were all part of our empire. In my child's ignorance, I thought the empire and the whole world were the same thing, you see. So, and I don't believe I was alone in that respect. So there was this uh, presentation to children growing up. I'm 81 this month, so we're going back, let's say roughly 75 years. And we were brought up with the idea that the greatest thing in the world was us, and we should celebrate that and be proud of it. But yeah, pride was very important. We had to be very proud of who we were. And so there was that at that age. And then, of course, a gradual unraveling as one reads more and discovers more, etc. But that was what I grew up with, the concept of empire, its centrality to our lives. And that was in England, Swindon. I don't know if the others who may have grown up in a different part of the world at that time, or round about then.
Well, I certainly have similar memories to you. I'm 85, and I can remember the great big pink maps all in the school buildings when I finally got there. But I mean, maybe I should offer you a bit of good news. Maybe, well, maybe not.
Please.
The born historian Niall Ferguson has a generous, almost fairy tale view of our past. His 2008 book, Empire, How Britain Made the Modern World, begins with the words, Once upon a time, there was an empire that governed roughly a quarter of the world's population, covered about the same portion of the Earth's land surface, and dominated nearly all its oceans. He wants us to know that, quote, no organization in history has done more to promote free movement of goods, capital, and labor than the British Empire, and that no organization has done more to impose Western norms of law, order, and governance around the world. The British Empire was the biggest empire, bar none. That's a spoonful of sugar to sweeten all the woke thoughts I keep drawing to your attention. But I must return to eugenics because, as Sean Wallace, a corpus linguistic expert, puts it, eugenics has never completely disappeared, in part because it provides an alternative narrative for governments wishing to explain poverty, etc., as natural, and therefore their own inaction in the face of such natural outcomes. In his 1931 book, The Science of Life, the novelist H.G. Wells cheerfully pointed out, at present, eugenics is merely an idea, is merely the word for what remains an impracticable idea. But it is clear that what men can do with wheat and maize may be done with every living species in the world. It is not ultimately necessary that a multitude of dull and timid people should be born. 3 years later, Professor Karl Pearson of University College in London spoke about the likelihood of eugenics transforming society. That lies in the future, he said, perhaps with Reich Chancellor Hitler and his proposals to regenerate the German people. In Germany, a vast experiment is at hand, and some of you may live to see its result. In 1997, Jonathan Freedland of The Guardian called eugenics the dirty little secret of the British left. The names of the first champions read like a roll call, he said, of British socialism's best and brightest. Sidney and Beatrice Webb, George Bernard Shaw, Harold Lasky, John Maynard Keynes, Marie Stopes. Thus, Bernard Shaw could write, the only possible, the only fundamental and possible socialism is the socialization of the selective breeding of man. In June 2020, 2 weeks after the 21st century leftist toppled Edward Colston statue, University College London announced that following an inquiry into the history of eugenics, the signs on the Galton Lecture Theatre, the Pearson Building, and the Pearson Lecture Theatre will be taken down with immediate effect. The UCL said it was a bequest from Francis Galton that enabled them to set up a laboratory headed by Britain's first professor of eugenics, Karl Pearson. And UCL went on to acknowledge with deep regret that it played a fundamental role in the development, propagation, and legitimization of eugenics, and that Galton's ideas are, quote, directly linked to atrocities against millions of people. Galton knew his proposal would mean the death of thousands and set out what he thought must happen to bring about the society he craved. Whenever a low race is preserved under conditions of life that exact a high level of efficiency, it must be subjected to rigorous selection. The few best specimens of that race alone can be allowed to become parents, and not many of their descendants can be allowed to live. From those two sentences, for me, they capture the essence of Hitler's policy from Germany and Europe for Germany. I'll repeat them. Whenever a low race is preserved under conditions of life that exact a high level of efficiency, it must be subjected to rigorous selection. The best specimens of that race can alone be allowed to become parents, and not many of their descendants can be allowed to live. It's an attitude and vision disowned by the British public during the Second World War by support for an official report by William Beveridge that called for Britain to rid itself of what Beveridge called the five great evils: squalor, ignorance, want, disease, and idleness. The BBC's fact file on the Beveridge report sums it up this way. In 1945, Prime Minister Clement Attlee announced the introduction of the welfare state as outlined in the Beveridge report. This included the establishment of a National Health Service in 1948 with free medical treatment for all. A national system of benefits was also introduced to provide social security so that the population would be protected from the cradle to the grave. Flash forward 2018 and a United Nations report from Professor Philip Alston about the British government's policy on extreme poverty and human rights. Says Alston, British compassion has been replaced by a punitive, mean spirit and often callous approach designed to impose a rigid order on the lives of those least capable of coping. The social safety net has been badly damaged by drastic cuts to the local authorities' budgets, which have eliminated many social services, reduced policing services, closed libraries in record numbers, shut communities and youth centres, and sold off public spaces and buildings. Alston doesn't mince his words. He says, it might seem to me that to some observers that the Department of Work and Pension has been tasked with designing a digital and sanitized version of the 19th century workhouse made infamous by Charles Dickens, rather than seeking to respond creatively and compassionately to the real needs of those facing widespread economic insecurity. One example of Britain abandoning the social security from the cradle to the grave is the two-child limit imposed by the Conservative and Liberal Democrats in 2010 that stops households from receiving additional benefits for the third and any subsequent children. According to the most recent figures, more than 100,000 children have been hit by this deliberately punitive measures. As one of Britain's most famous epidemiologists has put it, health statistics represents people with the tears wiped out. Alison Garnham, Chief Executive of the Child Poverty Action Group, thinks the two-child limit and benefit cap are hugely harmful for children because they break the link between a family's assessed need and their entitlement to support. Both policies force families to live on less they need. Both are driving up child poverty. Let me bring you right up to date. Next week, a book is being launched, and here I was going to pick up the cover of the book and show you, and now I can't do it. A book is being launched by two Glasgow health experts, David Walsh and Jerry McCartney. It looks at austerity and life expediency in the UK. The title is a question. Social murder? The book is a mixture of vignettes from individuals and families that have been affected by austerity, buttressed by pages of tables and statistical analysis. The authors say, The changes to life expectancy and mortality since the early 2010s has been nothing short of extraordinary. More than that, they have been tragic. They ask the question, why has this happened? They say the answer is very clear and best explained by the economic policies introduced by the UK government since 2010. It's about austerity, they say. Although most UK government departments were affected by the biggest areas of budget reductions, were the local government spending on social security. Social security has been described by the World Bank as the protection that society provides for individuals and households to guarantee income security, particularly in cases of old age, unemployment, sickness, invalidity, maternity, or the loss of a breadwinner. Walsh and McCartney say about 9 million people in the UK have been affected by austerity cuts. They claim there is international evidence, arguably going back centuries rather than decades, which proves that poverty is very bad for you. Put more bluntly, poverty kills, and austerity has increased poverty levels in the UK. Early this morning, my breakfast was spoilt by a headline in The Guardian. Reeves molds deeper cuts to public services as borrowing costs soar. Inside my head, Joan Baez was singing, "When will they ever learn? When will they ever learn?" Thank you.
Wow.
Thank you very much. Thank you, Martin. It's oh, sorry. Something happened to screen sharing.
I think I've just
we've managed to get.
Well done, you've got it.
Yeah.
Hey.
It's going to be officially launched next week. There are various right-wing economists in the audience primed to ask them questions. It could be quite interesting. It is full of tables. It's a tough read. The vignettes are quite in. My copy only came 2 days ago, and I confess I will never be able to sort out the tables, but it is a document that I think is pretty important. It'd be interesting to see whether the government says anything, or whether they do a Philip Hammond and say Britain's not like that at all.
Oh,
I thought it was.
wonderful!
I'd show it.
Sorry, go on, David. Sorry.
No, I found it and thought I would show it. Yeah, I thought it was useful. So
yeah, well done.
Thank you for the title, Martin.
Yeah, thank you very much, Martin. It seems strange not being able to see the face of the person that you're thanking.
Imagine all sorts of things, can't you? Or you can look at last May's tape again, and you'll see me saying some things, but some different things as well. And I thank you very much for letting me to let a little bit of my anger ooze out to somebody else, and I hope it doesn't make you too angry.
Well, it's not a bad thing if it does make us angry, in my opinion. Don't forget, Martin, that when this is when David what's the correct word, David? Should I be saying records or say
uploads it to YouTube?
Yeah, okay. Once it goes on to YouTube, our productions do get watched by a very large number of people who can't necessarily make it to the 11 o'clock spot on a Friday. But we do get a very high readership, don't we? What was our record? 400, I think.
Yeah, yes. Sometimes, typically it's in the sort of 20s, 30s, and 40s. So it's a multiple of our smaller audience.
Yeah. Yes, that's the best way to put it. Okay. Well, thank you very much. While Martin's still there, does anybody want to ask anything at this point?
Yeah.
not to ask, but just to say that was very erudite and left me feeling very intellectually deficient, but also miserable and sad and not optimistic, which is a bit sad too.
It's the kind of thing that makes me feel really excited as I rush out and start buying books that I really can't afford to try and catch up with all the bits of my education which I fear to are missing. But yeah.
I think it is very difficult to deal with, though. I think that the Jonathan Friedland piece again in the Guardian, how does one live with all this awfulness around you, and you've just got to pick up the little bits and keep pressing on with the love that one has, and to be so pleased when you see people acting kindly and generously, which they do in the thousands. And just hope that things do change, and to look at some of the changes, many of the changes in the 20th century have been good. It's just that we are landed with this awful approach, and that the only thing that matters is keeping the rich happy, because if we don't do that, we're all going to be worse off. Instead of which, we're keeping the rich happy, and we're all, people who are poor are becoming larger and poorer. It's not good.
Martin, your last talk, Living with History in a Pandemic, is up to 89 views now. So, it's not what social media people would say gone viral, but it's at least it gets out there. I'm doing something. I've got a project at the moment about solar energy, and I'm just putting little talks out on video, and not even just making them public rather than limited, restricted. And I'm getting comments from Australia, so the network does help, but if only the network can be used in some way that we lift up the whole population rather than privilege another limited group.
It is a problem. I mean, I think the only thing you really can say for humanity is that millions and millions of people are trying hard to make things better, getting in the state. You have to understand also that as far as Galton and Adolf Hitler were concerned, they were set on making the world a better place as well. So it's always what you do and how you do it, constant source of worry and concern, but a worry and concern that I think we have to try and deal with.
Thank you, Martin. That's great. Because Ray's not here, it's come to me to tell you that next week, Barbara Sullivan, I think she, forgive me, I think she works for the council, is going to be talking to us about the issues involved in resettling Ukrainians in Bristol. So that might be, I hope that will be interesting. Okay. Thank you very much indeed then. Thank you. Okay. See you next week, hopefully.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Thanks.